Hi everyone, and welcome back to the ALMA certification training. In today's session, we'll discuss import profiles. This session is intended for staff users with the catalog administrator role, which is the only role with privileges to create import profiles. If you have not yet listened to the certification training introductory session, please do so before continuing, as it contains some useful information about the certification training in general. I'm presenting this session today from a live sandbox environment configured almost identically to your own sandbox. I do encourage you to follow along in your sandbox. Feel free to pause the recording in order to try out some of the things I'm demonstrating. We are planning a live question and answer call following the training. Please make note of any questions you have in preparation for that call and submit them to your project team in advance so we can come to that meeting prepared to respond. You may also want to search the ALMA Online Help for answers to your questions. ALMA supports creation of bibliographic records in batch via file import. Files can come, for example, from commercial vendors, cooperative cataloging projects, or from your own repository, for example, if you've exported a file of records, a set of records, in order to edit them and then re-import them. Import profiles interpret the information created in the file in order to create bibliographic records. In addition to creating the bib records, the profile can normalize the incoming bibliographic records, validate the incoming records to ensure that they conform to the MARC 21 standard and any local customizations that you've made. The import profile can search the repository for any existing records that may match the incoming record, and then define how those matches should be handled, either manually or automatically, whether they should be imported or not, whether they should be used to overlay the existing records or to be merged with the existing records. The import profile can also apply management tags or flags to the incoming bib records, for example, to mark them as being suppressed from publishing to the discovery system, or to be flagged for synchronization or not with OCLC or Libraries Australia. The profile can also create inventory records. For physical inventory, that would be holdings and item records, again, based on the information contained in the incoming file, or electronic inventory records, namely portfolio records. The profile will not create a new package, but can add portfolios to an existing package. The import profile assumes an input file that is in MARC 21 format, either XML format or MARC 21 binary. These are the only two formats currently supported. The profile can be configured to upload files individually, on demand, or automatically on a scheduled basis via an FTP server. As I mentioned, configuration of import profiles requires the catalog administrator role. You can access the import profiles by navigating to the Resource Configuration menu, and under the Record Import submenu, we have a link for import profiles. Go ahead and click on that, and you'll see here a list of all of the profiles that currently exist in the system. Some of these you should certainly see in your own sandbox. Some of them have been configured here in my sandbox. You can open any of the existing profiles in order to view or edit, in addition to running those or see the job history, the import jobs that ran using these particular profiles. In addition, you can create a new profile by clicking on Add New Profile, which is what we're going to do. The steps of the wizard for creating a new profile correspond to the tabs when you open an existing profile in edit mode, and I'll be making note of that as we proceed. But first, let me point out that the first step of creating a new profile is to select the type of profile that you want to create. There are several different choices here. We're going to be discussing the repository profile type, which will create bibliographic records and optionally also inventory records. There are two additional types here, New Order and Update Inventory, which are discussed in a separate session. These are for acquisitions. The New Order profile, as its name implies, in addition to creating bibliographic records and inventory records, can also create purchase order lines. And the Update Inventory import profile type is also used in acquisitions for updating inventory based on existing purchase order lines. So we're going to get started configuring a new import profile of the repository type. This profile will allow us to import a file containing information about bibliographic records as well as inventory records. The first step of the wizard, which corresponds to the profile details page or tab in the existing profile, is the profile details. We enter here a name for the profile, a profile description if you'd like. This will appear in the list of profiles that we saw when we navigated to the Import Profiles page. And let's go through each one of these parameters one by one. The originating system parameter allows us to indicate the external source of our records in the event that it's either WorldCat, OCLC, WorldCat, or Library of Congress. If not, then we can select other. This information does not affect the bibliographic records that are created. It's simply information that's stored within ALMA and is useful afterwards in order to help in the identification of matching records. ALMA will make note internally of the source system for the records that were created by the import. And in the event that additional records are imported from that source, ALMA will have an easier time identifying matches once it knows that the records that it's looking for were created from that source. The physical source format, as we mentioned, needs to be in MARC 21, either in XML or in binary. The source format parameter is not configurable. It's fixed at MARC 21 bibliographic. The load file source allows us to select either upload, in which case we'll need to manually upload a file to ALMA in order to run the import job. The file can be located in the PC or the laptop or any network drive that you have access to from your computer. Alternatively, you can select FTP, which opens a number of additional fields which we'll be discussing. Selecting FTP here allows you to place the import files on an FTP server in a particular directory that's going to be defined and upload the files, the import files from there, either manually or on a scheduled basis, as we'll see. Having selected FTP, we see that the first parameter we have is files to import. We can choose to select to import all of the files that are currently on the FTP server in the specified directory, regardless of whether they've been imported in the past or not. Alternatively, and probably more typically, you will choose to import only those files that are new on the directory. In other words, files that have not yet been imported into ALMA. ALMA keeps track of the files that it imports, and so even if there are older files still on the FTP server in that directory that have already been imported, ALMA will not import them again if you select here New. You can schedule the FTP import to run several times a day, or once a day, or once a week, or once a month. The specific times here are not customizable. However, these are the actually five choices that you've got. You can configure an FTP, but not necessarily schedule it. If you do choose a schedule, you can also choose to activate or deactivate the schedule. Only if the schedule is activated, regardless of what you've selected here, will the FTP then be able to run on that schedule. The FTP information fields down here are discussed in detail in a separate session in the resource management integration session, and so I refer you to that session for a more detailed discussion of configuring these particular fields. They're fairly straightforward. You input the FTP information, the server port, username and password, input directory, etc. And once you've configured the FTP, you have a little test connection button down here, which allows you to verify that the parameters that you've configured for the FTP connection are in fact valid. Going back up here to file name patterns, this is also in use with the FTP. This serves as a kind of filter so that even if you've selected to import files that are only new or even all files on the FTP directory, entering a file name pattern here allows Alma to filter the files that are on the FTP directory and only import those that are in accordance with the file name that you enter here, or the file pattern. For example, if you only want to import XML files, you could enter something like this, *.xml, and then only files with that extension would be imported. The next parameter is the crosswalk. This is reserved for future development. It's currently not configurable. As to the target format is not configurable. It's fixed at Mark 21 bibliographic. Finally, the active parameter allows you to choose whether this profile should be active or not. If the file is not active, if the profile is not active, you will not be able to run it on a scheduled basis via the FTP, nor will you be able to run it manually. However, if the file is profile is active, then even if the scheduler is inactive or set to not scheduled, you'll still be able to run the import job using this profile on a manual or on-demand basis. Let's go on to the next screen of the wizard. Which corresponds to the normalization and validation tab in the existing profile. Here we have two parameters. First, the normalization. You can select from the drop-down, from the list contained in the drop-down, the normalization routine that you want to apply to all of the bibliographic records that are going to be imported by virtue of this profile. The details of normalization profiles, routines, and their configuration was discussed in a separate session. But you can select here all of those that were configured previously, and these will be applied to all of the bibliographic records that are being imported. So to the validation exception profile, you select here from a list of those validation exception profiles that have already been configured. Actual customization configuration of these exception profiles was discussed in a separate session as well. The recommendation here for import profiles is to use the marked XML bib import exception profile. Going on to the next screen, which is the match and merge screen. We select here the match methods. Alma can use the import profile to search the repository against the incoming records to see if in fact there are any matches. And of course, in order to identify matches, we need to define the method we want to use in order to define a match. These methods were similarly discussed in a separate session. You have a number of different options here based on individual identifiers or a collection of identifiers or a fuzzy method that uses a variety of different bibliographic fields, the title and author, etc. You have one match method for serial records and a separate match method, although parallel match method, for non-serial records. We have the match actions parameter. First of all, upon match, how we should manage the records that are being imported if in fact Alma finds a match in the system. Should we nevertheless import them, or indeed if there's a match, should we not import them, or shall we use the incoming records to overlay the existing records, or shall we merge the incoming records with the existing records? In the event that we select merge here, then this parameter down here, merge method, becomes applicable. This is the method that will be used by Alma to merge the incoming record with the existing record in the event that a match indeed has been found. And as long as we're talking about merge, I'll point out that this is only applicable in the case that there's only a single match that's found. If multiple matches are found, we'll see in a moment how Alma will handle that. It's also possible to configure the import profile to delete existing records. If a match is found between the incoming record and an existing record, we can mark the profile to delete the existing record. Now, this is going to be only under certain circumstances, and that is as follows, that the incoming record is marked as a deleted record, and that's done in the leader field, position 5, if there's a lowercase d. Again, if the leader field in the incoming record in position 5 has a lowercase d, that indicates to Alma that that record should be deleted. If indeed there's a matching record in the repository, that record should be deleted. In addition, however, the record will be deleted only if the existing record has no inventory records associated with it. If there is any inventory, then the bib record will not be deleted, even if there's a match and even if the incoming record has a lowercase d in position 5 of the leader field. Also for PDA portfolios, if the bib record existing in the repository is associated with a PDA portfolio, the bib record will only be deleted if the PDA ID is the same as that in the PDA profile. The next parameter is unlink records from the community zone. This means that in the event that a match is found between the record in the import file and records existing in the repository, and the record in the repository is linked to the community zone, selecting this parameter will delink the record from the community zone, and that record will then be treated as a local record going forward and no longer linked to the community zone. The handling method parameter allows us to determine how we want to handle any matches that are found by virtue of the import, either manually, in which case matches will be sent to the manual handling workbench, and we'll see a report of those records as a result of the import. Alternatively, we can choose to handle matches automatically, in which case we have additional parameters that open up down here. If the match is going to be handled automatically, then of course we can choose either to merge or overlay. If we've selected here manual, then regardless of what we've chosen upon match up here, the matched record will be sent to the manual handling workbench for staff involvement. Having selected here match handling method automatic, we have two additional parameters that open here. Disregard matches for community zone linked records. In other words, if the match that's identified in ALMA is on a community zone record, we can choose to ignore that match and import the record that's coming from the import file as though there were no match. Alternatively, if there's more than one match, but one of those or more of them are linked to the community zone, those records will be excluded from the matching, and if only one matched record exists, then we will apply the parameters that we've selected up here, whether it's merge or overlay, and if by merge, which merge method to use. The second parameter that's available if we've selected the automatic handling method is the skip and do not import parameter. This means that any records in the import file that match existing records will simply be skipped. They won't be imported. They won't be sent to the manual handling workbench. They will be included in a report of the import job, but we will not need to perform any kind of manual handling. They simply won't be imported, and that's that. The final parameter on this screen is the no match or upon no match parameter, which allows the import profile to support several different scenarios. For example, in the event that you want to create a new bibliographic records based on the import profile and the import file, you assume that the import file contains bibliographic records that do not exist in your repository, and that's your intention in loading that file, then you would select here upon no match import. However, there is a scenario in which you want to import records from the import file only in the event that there are matching records in the repository. For example, if you've loaded a file of brief records for ordering purposes, for example, and afterwards want to load a file that has fuller bibliographic information for those records, you don't want to create new bibliographic records. You only want to update or overlay or merge the new records with the brief records already in the system. So in that case, you would select upon no match, do not import. In other words, only in the event that the import file has, or Alma finds a matching record in the repository for a record in the import file, only then would the record be imported, and then based on the selections up here, that record would either be imported or overlay the existing record or merged with the existing record. Let's go on to the next screen now, and that is the Management Tags screen. This screen allows us to apply management tags or flags to the incoming bibliographic records, and we have several different options here. The first flag would be to mark the bib record to be suppressed from publishing. In other words, any record that's going to be created by virtue of the import will be flagged not to be published to the discovery system, Primo or whatever it is you may be using. We also have two flags for synchronization, one with OCLC and one with Libraries Australia. You can choose to flag the incoming bibliographic records not to be synchronized or to be synchronized either for holdings or bibliographic records for OCLC, and for Libraries Australia only the bibliographic records. Moving on to the next screen brings us to the repository tab of the existing import profile. Here we have four different options for whether or not to create inventory records as a result of the import, and if so, what kind of inventory to create, either electronic or physical or both. The default option is none, which is to say that no inventory records would be created by virtue of the import, only the bibliographic records that were contained in the import file. Alternatively, we can choose to create electronic inventory in addition to the bibliographic records. The assumption here is that all of the records contained in the import file contain only electronic inventory, specifically portfolios, electronic portfolios, which could be either standalone portfolios or portfolios that are part of a package. We'll come back to this shortly. Alternatively, we can select to create inventory records for physical inventory, holdings, and item records. The assumption here is that all of the records in the import file contain only physical inventory. A third alternative to creating inventory records is to create mixed. In other words, the assumption here is that the import file may contain some records that should result in electronic inventory records, other records that should create physical inventory records, and so we're able to handle such an import file in a single import profile by selecting the mixed option under inventory operations. Now, unlike the first two options of electronic and physical, where assumption is that the import file is homogeneous in terms of the kind of inventory that should be created, because in this case that's not an assumption we can make, we need to indicate for each record in the import file whether it's going to be resulting in physical inventory records being created or electronic inventory records that should be created. And in order to do that, we indicate here a sort of mapping. We indicate here the mark field and subfield that are in the import file that contain an indication as to whether the information in that particular record in the file should be physical or electronic, whether it should result in the creation of physical inventory or electronic inventory. So, for example, if I have a mark field in the import profile in each of the records in the import profile, which is 987 subfield A, just as an example, the import profile for each record for which inventory is going to be created must contain a mark 987 subfield A in that record with an indication as to whether the material is physical or electronic. The content of this subfield that Alma is going to expect to see is as follows. For electronic inventory, the content of this subfield, and again, whatever field and subfield you designate here, what's important is that that be the field and subfield that's actually in the import file. The content of that subfield for electronic inventory must be an uppercase E. For physical inventory, the syntax is an uppercase P. In this way, Alma will be able to know whether the information that's contained in that particular record in the import file should result in the creation of electronic inventory if the content of that subfield is E, or in physical inventory records if the content of that subfield is P. Okay, let's go on now to the electronic inventory mapping fields. We have several different options here. First of all, whether the import profile is going to create standalone profiles, or whether the profiles that will be created as a result of the import should be considered part of a package. If we create a standalone profile by virtue of the import, then we have a number of additional fields here that we can complete. The material type, we can choose book, would be an ebook, for example, or a journal, or whatever it is that we're going to be creating. We can choose to use a proxy or not, which will allow access to that electronic inventory. If we select to use a proxy, then we have an additional field that opens up here that allows us to select any of the proxies that have already been configured in Alma. Configuration of proxies takes place under the General Configuration menu, and the integration profiles, it's beyond the scope of this particular session, but any proxies that have been configured there will appear here in the dropdown and can be selected for use with all of the profiles that are going to be created by virtue of this particular import. If we've selected to create a portfolio type of standalone, then the single portfolio and multiple portfolios parameter is grayed out. It's read-only. We can't create anything. The assumption here is that each record in the import profile is going to be a single portfolio. We'll see in just several moments. If we select the import profile to be part of a package, then we can select which type of portfolio should be collected, what type of record is included in the import profile, import file, whether it's a single portfolio or multiple portfolio. Let's go ahead now with the remaining fields under the assumption that we're going to be creating a standalone portfolio. The assumption is that there's some kind of information contained in each record in the file that contains the connection information, specifically the URL for that particular resource, and we entered the mark field and subfield that are in the import file that contain that information. If there is more than one field that contains that information, if the field that contains that information is repeated in the record in the file, let's say it's 856, and the information may be in subfield U, let's say, and you have an 856U that appears several times in a particular record, and only one of them is the actual URL that you want to use for this resource. The others contain additional information, access to help files, etc. You can choose to skip those other 856 fields on the assumption that they have unique indicators, that the indicators of those 856s are different than the indicators of the 856 that actually contains the URL you want to use. And you can see here the tooltip that's displaying for how you can enter the different indicator pairs that should be skipped. You can enter one pair or more than one pair. Each pair is just 2 digits without any separation between them. And if you want to indicate more than one pair, you place a comma after each pair. You can use wildcards, for example, the pound sign or space. This will allow you to indicate specifically which 856 field, in our example, contains the URL that should be taken and which 856 fields should be skipped. The next parameter is the extract interface name from the field. The assumption is that there's an interface name contained in each record in the import file, and you enter the marked field and subfield here that contains that information in the import file. In the event that those records do not contain any information, you can select a default interface name here. Clicking on the search icon will bring you to a list of the existing interfaces in the system. You simply select the interface that you want and click on select, and that will become the interface for all of the electronic resources that are created by virtue of this import, in the event that no other interface is indicated in the particular record in the field and subfield that you indicate here. There are a number of note fields, 3 different note fields that can also be imported by way of the file and by virtue of the import profile. You indicate here the mark field and subfield that contains, for example, the internal description note. You can have a default internal description note, which will be applied to all of the records that are created in the event that either nothing has been configured here or nothing is contained in the file in the field and subfield in a particular record. Similarly, for the authentication note, the marked field and subfield of each record that contains an authentication note in the import file, and in the event that the records do not contain a authentication note, or that you want to apply a single authentication note to all the records, you can include a default authentication note here, and that will be applied to each of the records that's created. Similarly, the public note, again, the mark field and subfield of the records in the import file that contain the public note, and a default public note if you'd like to have that. Finally, we have the extract library from field and subfield parameter, which allows you to assign a library ownership to the electronic resource that's going to be created. In the event that the record does not contain any information in the field and subfield that you've indicated here, you can assign a default. Clicking on the search icon here will bring you to a list of all of the libraries in your Alma environment. You simply select one of the libraries and click select, and that will be placed in the profile as the default library, which will be the owner of the electronic resource that's being created. Electronic resources don't necessarily need a library ownership. However, you can choose to have your resources owned by a particular library if you want. Finally, the last parameter is activate resource. You can choose to activate automatically all of the resources that are going to be created by virtue of the import. No further actions would be required in this particular case. So that's the electronic inventory fields. Again, in the event that we've selected here the standalone, this profile will create standalone portfolios in Alma with configured according to the information that's contained in the import file, according to how we've defined the profile here. Now, if we select part of a package, we'll see that a couple of additional fields open up here, namely the package and the service. The import profile will not create a new package. However, it will allow you to create portfolios via the import, which are part of an existing package. You can click the search icon here and search the list of packages in your Alma. Select the package that you want these portfolios to be a part of. Clicking select will enter that package into this field, and all of the portfolios that are created by virtue of the import will be part of the package that you've selected here. Once you've selected a package, the service field also becomes populated with all the services that are available for this particular package that have been activated already in Alma. What you have here is only one choice, because this particular package has only this one service. If there were additional services, table of contents or abstract, whatever it might be, you could see them here and select them as well. Similarly, the material type, we discussed this. There's no difference here between the portfolio type as standalone and the portfolio type part of a package. This is the material type that will be assigned to each of the portfolios that are being created. Now, one thing that is different when you've selected part of a package, and that is this parameter, single portfolio or multiple portfolios, now becomes active and you can select. Single portfolio, selecting single portfolio in this case, means that each record in the import file contains one and only one portfolio, contains information about only a single portfolio. In each record, you may have multiple records in the file and multiple portfolios will be created, but each record will create only a single portfolio. On the other hand, you could have a single record in the import file which contains multiple portfolios. You may have multiple records and each record contains multiple portfolios, or in a single portfolio, but if there are records that contain more than one portfolio, again in a single record in the import file, you could select your multiple portfolios, and then what happens is that these field and subfield parameters change to subfield. The correct configuration here is that you enter a single field in the import profile, in the record in the import file, that contains all of the information concerning the particular portfolio. This field may be repeated multiple times in a single record. The assumption is that if you've selected multiple portfolios, that this field will be repeated multiple times in a single record. But each field in the record, each time, each occurrence, each instance of the field in a given record will contain all the information pertinent for a single portfolio. So again, in our example here, the 856 would contain all of the information concerning a single portfolio, and in the event that the 856 occurs multiple times in a single record, multiple portfolios would potentially be created based on each instance of the 856 within that record. So having selected the field here, the assumption is that all of the information is going to be in the subfield, a distinct subfield within this field. And you notice here that the URL now has changed from field and subfield to only a subfield. So to all of the notes, the internal description, the authentication note, the public note, now have a field only for entering the subfield. The assumption that these are going to be subfields of the field that has been selected here. So again, if we're creating multiple portfolios, the assumption is that a given record, a single record within the import file, may contain information about multiple portfolios, and that the information about each portfolio in that record will be contained in a single field, in this case 856, with each subfield containing information about each of these notes, for example, and the URL, etc., and the library, and that each 856 within that particular record would contain information about a distinct portfolio. So that's the difference those are the differences between selecting standalone or part of a package, and also between selecting single portfolio and multiple portfolios. Let's go on now to a discussion of the physical item mapping section, which will create physical inventory records, holdings, and item records by virtue of the import process. Here again you have the material type. This is the physical material type that will be assigned to the item record that's created by virtue of the import. These fields are not customizable, but you can select from the list that does exist. You need to select a library field here, and subfield physical inventory must have an owner, and so you must select a library and field and subfield. Again, this is the mark field and subfield in the import profile that contains the information, in this case concerning the library, which is the owner of the physical resource that will be created. In addition to the library field, of course, physical inventory must have a location. Holdings are location specific, and so you must enter the mark field and subfield contained in the import record that has the location information. In the event that that information is not in the file, you can select a default library and location. Selecting the library here will populate the default location with a list of all of the locations that are part of the selected library here. You can select the mapping checkbox, the Map Library and Locations checkbox. This will allow you to create a mapping of the library and location codes that are contained within the import file, which may be different but correspond to the library and location codes used within ALMA. So for example, if the main library stacks location in ALMA appears in the import profile as library ABC location 123, we would need to create a mapping between the ABC 123 library location and the main library stacks location, and we'll see how to create that mapping in several minutes. Selecting this checkbox here means that ALMA should consult that mapping table when creating the imported records by virtue of this import profile. Next, we can indicate the number of items that should be created by virtue of the record that's going to be imported, how many physical items are being imported, how many physical item records should be created. We enter here the marked field and subfield that contains that information. If the information is not in the record, we can enter a default number here. The system default is 1, and so if you only want to create one record, you don't need to complete anything here. Only if you want to create more than one physical item or less than one physical item, something other than one, then you can enter a default number here. Similarly, if the import file contains barcode information, you can enter the marked field and subfield where the barcode is found in each record, and the barcode will be created automatically on the physical item record that's being created by virtue of the import. So too, if you want to assign a item policy to the item record that's going to be created, and that item policy is contained in the import file, you can enter the marked field and subfield in this parameter in order to assign the policy to the item. Finally, you can choose to update the call number in the holdings record that's going to be created by the import on the basis of the call number information contained in the imported bibliographic record. Now, it is possible to create multiple physical items in a single import. Each item would have its own barcode, for example. Perhaps obviously items would need to have a unique barcode, and you can do that using a single import profile. I refer you to the instructions that are contained in the release notes from the ALMA 2013 release on page 61. You have a detailed description here of how you would configure the import profile, several different options for creating multiple records from a single import file. So that's pretty much it for the profile. If we are configuring a new profile, if we save this profile now, and open it up in edit mode, we'll see an additional tab that we did not see during the wizard when we were creating the new profile, and that is the mapping tab. The mapping tab is referred to when we've selected the map library and location parameter when creating the physical inventory. The mapping tab allows us to inform ALMA as to what the correspondence should be between the information, the library and location information specifically, contained in the import profile, and how it should correspond to the library and location in ALMA. So if, for example, I have an import file that contains the following information for library and location, in the fields and subfields that I've designated in the inventory section, in the library field and subfield and location field and subfield, as corresponding to the information in the record in the import file that contains the library and location, and I've selected to map that information, then if the information in the import file contains, for example, ABC/123, and I know that that corresponds to the main library stacks location, I would select here main library. I would select the stacks location here. I've now created the mapping between ABC123 in the import file and the main library stacks location in ALMA. So ALMA will now know that the inventory, the physical inventory that's going to be created that has the code ABC123 in the import file should in fact be a holdings and items record in the main library stacks location. And I can continue to do that for whatever additional codes and libraries and locations may exist in the file, in the import file. So this concludes our presentation of import profiles in ALMA. Let's have a brief review of the things that we've discussed. We learned that import profiles allow you to create bibliographic as well as inventory records in batch based on an import file. Import profiles can be configured to create bibliographic records only, bibliographic and physical inventory records, bibliographic and electronic inventory records, or bibliographic, physical inventory, and electronic inventory records, all from a single import file. Import profiles allow you to flag records to suppress them from being published to the discovery system, to publish or suppress from being synchronized with OCLC and Libraries of Australia. Import profiles can be configured to import records only if no matching records are found in a repository, or only if matching records are found, and then use the incoming records to overlay or merge with the existing records. Finally, import profiles can import files automatically according to a schedule via an FTP server, or manually upon demand and via file upload. Let's take a look at just a couple of review questions. The first question: Ken would like to import a brief bibliographic record, a file of brief bibliographic records, as placeholders for future orders, but he doesn't want patrons who search in Primo to see these brief records. What would you advise Ken to do in order to achieve this objective? 1. Wait until he gets full versions of the bib records. 2. Import the file, but select None in the Inventory Information tab of the import profile. Or 3. Configure the import profile to flag records as suppressed from publishing to the discovery system. The correct answer to this question is C. Configure the import profile to flag records as suppressed from publishing to the discovery system. Ken could, of course, wait until he gets full versions of the bib records, but that would defeat the purpose. He wants to import brief records in order to use them for creating orders for those records, orders for inventory for those bib records. So A would not be a satisfactory solution. B would also not allow Ken to achieve his objective. By importing the file and creating the bib records, even without inventory, would not in and of itself suppress the bib records that were created from being discoverable in Primo. So the correct answer to this question is C. Ken should configure the import profile and use the management tags to suppress the created bib records from being published to the discovery system. The next question. Ken receives a new file with full bibliographic information. He would like to load this file into his institutional repository, but doesn't want to create duplicates of the brief records he imported previously. What would you suggest to Ken? A. Delete the brief records and then import the file. B. Configure the import profile to import upon match and overlay or merge the brief records with the full records. Or C. Use external search resources to manually import full versions of the brief records. The correct answer to this question is B. Configure the import profile to import upon match and overlay or merge the brief records with the full records. A would not be a satisfactory solution. Deleting the brief records would delete not only the bibliographic information, but also any inventory that was related to those records and any order information that was created to those records. Answer C is a possible solution. Ken could search external resources in order to import full versions of the brief records, but that would be a very labor-intensive process. Since Ken has a file that contains full bibliographic information, he can configure the import profile to import only upon finding a match with the existing record, and then use the full record contained in the import file to overlay or merge with the brief records already in his system. That concludes this session on import profiles. Thank you very much for your participation. If you have any questions or would like to practice any of the things that we've discussed, please feel free to do so. And send us your questions in advance of the question and answer session that we're planning. Thank you again for your participation. We hope to see you very soon in another Alma certification training session. Bye for now.